Well, hey now. Welcome to Fitz's Electric Bar. Been doing some conversations recently and sharing those on my channel. And Lost Mixtapes, Todd and I have a couple parts of our conversation, part one on mine and part two on his. But I've been really enjoying these, and hopefully there's something that those of you who watch and follow our channels would also enjoy. I'm going to introduce you now to a guy. I've actually posted a couple videos of his already, or a couple of videos with him. His name is Rick. I worked with Rick for quite a few years at Future Shop and Best Buy here in Canada, and we worked on some music projects, among other things. And it was a pleasure to work with him. He was also a few levels up from me, and so we didn't really have a friendship at that time, keeping a respectful distance, as it were. But subsequent to that time, it's been quite a few years since then, we've been hanging out and talking music, and we just love it. And like a lot of us, I bet, you get together and you have a cup of coffee and you look up and it's like 2 hours have passed. And the other part that I enjoy is that probably about three-quarters or more is specifically about music. And it's just tangents and ramblings and sharing excited thoughts. Subsequent to kind of reconnecting with Rick, we started sharing stuff back and forth, sending clips off of YouTube of live performances and things like that. And I thought it would be kind of fun to bring Rick on and have his wealth of knowledge. Rick has got a very broad, very eclectic wealth of knowledge about music. He's a few years older than me, which means that when I was kind of going through my adolescent times when you're really enjoying music, I was listening to a lot of what I would call classic rock stuff. I mentioned before Aerosmith, Bad Company, Foghat, things like that. Rick, being just a few years my senior, was into things like Traffic and Cream. And it's a real pleasure for me to interact with Rick, learn some things from him, and talk about some shared interests. So please enjoy and let us know what you think. Like and subscribe. Carpe diem. Cheers.
How you doing?
I'm really good. How are you?
I'm all right. Kind of a hectic day here, but other than that, all good.
Okay, so why don't we jump in? This is part one of two of a conversation with my friend Rick. As we spoke about, I thought what I'd like to do is I'd like to have a bit of a conversation with you in this first part to get to know you a little bit better. We've already got two videos with you as a part of those videos, including the excellent Delaney and Bonnie deep dive into that record. So
Very
I
deep dive.
thought deep dive. No, but it was great and very thorough. And so the first part's going to be getting to know you a little bit. So I always find that context is an interesting part. So keeping in mind that we're going to be talking a lot about music over the course of all of this, kind of want to look at and understand a little bit about your background, where you grew up, and it probably helped to form some of your listening habits and things like that. So we'll do that first, and then we'll do a few. I'm going to do some. We'll do some rapid fire questions, and that'll be just kind of fun to get a sense of your taste and choices between different things.
This
And
is that the is this the Brian Fitzgerald kind of the actor's studio? The 10
exactly,
questions by whatever his name is. But yeah,
exactly. That is exactly it. I have no credibility, but I'll do it anyways. So, um, and then part two, we'll kind of focus on some records. You and I know, have pulled some records that we want to talk about.
sure.
Somewhat random, but things that we might want to just kind of say why we think these are interesting or important, or why we're listening to them now, or whatever is the reason for that. So why
Yeah.
don't we just start? Tell me a little bit, and tell the people who are watching a little bit about where you grew up, and maybe as you're telling those stories of where you grew up, maybe some of the music or times when you remembered music kind of becoming important to you, and what was it that you were hearing that was of interest to you?
Sure. So I was born in I'm Canadian and born in Northern Ontario, actually in a city called Sudbury, which at the time had a huge, I think still does actually, has a huge smelting plant for nickel, copper, and so, again, raw resources being converted. And it was a major, and, a lot of mining in that whole area. And my family background, my mom's side of her family, long history working in the mines. My dad was emigrated to Canada from Europe in 1951, I think, and came here literally. It's like showed up with a quarter in his pocket. Was considered was in a refugee camp in Italy for 6 months, the whole deal. But anyways, he ended up in Sudbury. And anyways, when I was born, my mom, my late mother, always took credit for me, uh, you know, being involved in music and the music business somewhat, but really being involved in music in a lot of different forms. Because she said that when Elvis was on television, I was sitting on her lap. So, that was one of those things. I never ever went back and checked it. I think I did ask her what show. I don't think she could remember, but, she was always like, oh, yeah, well, I think that's why you loved, rock music and, all this kind of business. But, I mean, I grew up, I was the oldest out of three kids. And I had a cousin my father, cousin from my father's side who emigrated from Italy as well. And I remember her that kind of the first things I remember musically there was really she was quite young. So then I think would have been about a teenager, early teenager. And the big thing for her at the time was like Ricky Nelson and Bobby V and all these guys, that were kind of doing their thing. And I think, like a lot of people, I think when the Beatles hit the shores of North America here on the Ed Sullivan Show, that was a big deal. I remember my mom being excited. And I think back now, my mom was actually in her 20s. So for her, it was a big deal, but she was married, had, um, I think two kids at that point. Um, and, but, so I do remember the Beatles every week and then the whole British invasion thing. So that was really, I think, a really like a lot of people, I think at that time really drove a lot of awareness about, music, and it was exciting. I mean, it was a different look. And every week there was this whole cavalcade of artists from the UK, so fortunately got to see pretty much all of them on television at one point, right from the Stones first time to, the Kinks and, the Beatles and Jerry and the Pacemakers, the Dave Clark Five, who at the time, as I recall, were just huge. People don't talk that much about them nowadays. Obviously, not the same league as the Beatles or Stones, but big band, and a lot of that stuff going on. And I think really, that kind of carried over. I think into the mid '60s. I remember going to see the. Sounds ridiculous. We lived outside of Sudbury actually, and quite young, and it wasn't abnormal to get on the bus, go for a 40-minute bus ride to downtown Sudbury and go to the movies with my friends. So we would do that a lot. I think I remember that happening, I think when I was like 7 or 8. And, but anyways, the long story short, there was that, ended up getting, going to see Hard Day's Night, going to see Help at the theater, and that was a trip. I just remember that at the time being like crazy. I remember seeing Dave Clark Five, having a wild weekend at the theater. And so there was, the Tammy show. I remember seeing that at the theater. I remember that was great. I remember just loving that, right? It was all black and white, but just remember loving that as well. And, getting into, public school. And we moved, I think, from Sudbury to Southern Ontario in 1966 for my dad, just, better job and all this kind of stuff. So going down there was different because it was just, down to Burlington, Ontario, which was a real kind of bedroom community. You know, we had like one black guy in our school. I mean, it was, that's the kind of thing it was at that time, right? And, um, I just remember at that time kind of being into, the usual kind of pop things that were going on, as well as all this other British invasion and, the birds and all this kind of stuff. And then I remember just the big thing that exploded then roughly around 67, I think, late 66 into 67, I think, was Hendrix. The monkeys were happening almost concurrently, but I just remember Hendrix just being like, holy cow, it was like a comet hit the earth. That's all everybody could talk about, right? Oh,
So
yeah.
how
Sorry.
Sorry, how were you like when you think about Hendrix and that impact of him, kind of as you say, the comet
Mm.
hitting the Earth? How were you taking that in? Was it through TV? Was it through movies? Was it through a live performance? Or how were you kind of absorbing Hendrix and his music?
Well, I was too young to actually go to any performances at the time, much as I may have wanted to. I think a lot of it was really, a lot of it I think was through the media. I mean, just at that time, which was the three major networks and CBC in Canada, for example, and CTV, I think was the other channel at that time, or network at that time in Canada, for English speaking Canada. But really through that, and there was a lot happening news wise as well. So, you had this whole sort of flood of, the British post British invasion, and, the summer of love starting to happen. And, there was just a lot of different things going on, and riots starting to happen. And, it just became, the music in a way became the soundtrack for a lot of what was going on. And even when I was that young, I mean, I just remember things tweaking over time too, from the the three-piece, four-piece bands doing all these harmonies, and the playing Rickenbackers, to fuzz tones being used in the guitars with people's guitar playing. And the songs, a lot of things becoming a lot more sophisticated, certainly being driven by the Beatles, and lots of other different things. But I think Hendrix was a big one, right? And I think there was, from my recollection, certainly was a big game changer. I just remember the bands that were playing. I remember when I was in grade 6, and we used to have bands playing in the auditorium. This was like public school, and I remember the big band were these guys in our grade 6 or grade 7, these brothers, and they were playing like a pedal steel and a drum kit, and they're playing like Wipeout. And then, the next year, all of a sudden, people were using fuzz tones, and, bands, everybody was playing basically the greatest hits of Purple Haze, Foxy Lady, and what's the other one? Nobody was doing it, I think, all around the Watchtower, but along the Watchtower. But you get the gist of it. I mean, it just, those, there was a huge change. I mean, the Monkees were still popular, Paul Revere and the Raiders, but things were just gradually shifting. And, after that, I think just, as I was getting older, certainly in the late 60s, um, just people I knew, their older sisters and brothers were very influential. I'm going to talk about that actually when we go through our vinyl a bit, but very influential in terms of, people are kind of going, oh, no, that's not cool. This is very cool. This is, I remember people, the term underground was a big thing as well at the time, which ironically still gets used today. But so that was kind of, I think that journey. And then, getting into high school or whatever, again, there's all these different changes that happened.
Let's go
There
back.
was,
We'll just stop there for a second. We'll go back to the high
yeah,
school stuff. Do you remember your first record, or the record that sort of really you owned? It was yours. It was your choice that you purchased.
yeah, I do. It was double A side, actually. It was the Beatles' Day Tripper, and which was a double A side with We Can Work It Out. So that was my first single. And but hardly any albums. I just remember I think the first major album purchase that I had, uh, I remember I really liked the band Steppenwolf at a point. Sort of 67, 68, around there, 67, I think. And Magic Carpet Ride was out, and I had that as a single, and it used to drive my mother bonkers. She just was like, the whole feedback thing at the beginning. My mom was just, I just thought it was the best. My mom was always like, you turn that down, it's just, and that's of course playing it through a Seabreeze, a single, one speaker this big,
Yeah.
mono record player. But I think the first album I actually ever got was actually, strangely, Iron Butterfly, In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida. That was, and just, I mean, look, I grew up kind of blue collars, so money was tight. We were always, until I kind of started making some coin of my own. I mean, it was quite limited, but that was a big record. I just remember at the time too. It was like, it was crazy. And, but again, could never play it loud because, God help me, my mother would just go wild, right? But
That was a big one for me
going
as
down,
well. I remember a
yeah,
summer, I must have been 14 or 15. I went off to a French camp around Trois Rivières, and it was a rough experience, I'll tell you.
yeah.
They took care of the Anglo quite repeatedly. And but In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida was I don't remember how we were listening to it, if it was on the radio, but it seemed like I remember that summer and hearing In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida over and over again, and really loving it.
I have a kind of a funny story about that. I do remember that. I think I was in like grade 8 or something, and it became a thing. It was so popular. I just remember it became a thing with guys, certainly, and some of the guys that I knew. The whole drum solo in the middle, the Ron Bushy drum solo, which I know people don't talk about Ron Bushy the same way they talk about Ginger Baker or, whatever, Keith Moon, obviously, but, John Bonham, of course. But, that was just like, I remember people going on their desks doing the opening of the drum thing, and no, no, it's not like that. You got an extra, people just like, just very influential that way, right? So,
But tell me
funny.
about high school, and what kind of stuff were you listening to in high school? That might have been in Agata de Vida at some point, but what was kind
Yeah.
of your arc in high school?
Um, well, unlike a lot, I just actually, it's funny. The last year, my high school sent out this thing for their, I forgot whatever it was, their 50th reunion or something, and which I'm not, I wasn't there 50 years ago, thank God. But I actually hated high school. I'm not one of these people that was, God, I miss all my, I missed, I played football one year and whatever. But it's funny because I think at the end of the yeah, very end of the 69 in there into 69, I think. I was in the Royal Canadian Air Cadets for a while. And it was funny because there it was, this whole very sort of military discipline type thing. And a lot of fun in many ways too. But the guys are all cool. And, they were guys older and I was like fairly young. And I remember going to a summer camp there, I think at 69, up in Trenton, Ontario, Camp Trenton military base, and for 2 weeks. And I remember the guys there. We were all talking. People were all into the band in a big way, because they were Canadian. And the second band, the band album had come out. Johnny Winter, Second Winter, I think was going to be out or had been out at that point. So these things were in the first Johnny Winter certainly. And those were records that were, I remember just distinctly, they were kind of cool records and in addition to many other things, but those two pop out. I mean, I remember I got that time running out and buying the Johnny Winter Second Winter, and it was cool because the record only had three sides, right? So it wasn't a fourth side on the album, and, all that kind of stuff. But yeah, through high school, I mean, I think, like I think a lot of people, your first couple of years at high school, your first years, just remember hating it. Second year, I wasn't that big of a fan. I had started learning guitar in the late 60s. And, by 1970, early 70, was starting to play in bands and, starting bands and playing. So I did a lot of that through high school. And thank God, because I made some money and got me out of school a bit. And, you know,
Did you ever consider music as a career?
I did. Strangely enough, I did. It was funny because my mother at one point ended up working for a college in Ontario, not too far from where we lived in Burlington. And I don't really know the connection. This would have been, I think at when I was in grade 13, which we had at that time. Um, I remember that she came home and she gave me a card. And she goes, these guys are looking for, um, yeah, these guys are looking for some studio people. I told them you played guitar and they gave me your card. And it was a studio for, I think it was for Grant Avenue Studios, if I remember correctly,
Remember
which
Grant? Yeah.
was Grant Avenue Studios were in Hamilton, and which is where Eno and
Lanois.
Daniel Lanwell worked out of and all that. It was one of those where, and I remember going to her, well, look, I don't know what I'm doing. I wasn't even sure I was going to go to, university or whatever. And, and I ended up going to university. The person I was dating at the time was big on me doing that. And I was kind of, well, maybe you should do that. And I also remember getting a bit burned out on the gigging thing. I love gigging, but it's the stereotypical you're on stage for 2 hours, you're living for the 2 hours. And the rest of the time, it's not a lot of fun. It's a lot of boredom, a lot of travel, a lot of arguing about crap that you really shouldn't have to argue. We've got $30, or we got $20 for everybody's dinner. And one band I was in, the most money I ever made in a band was in a show band. It was like a 9 or 10 piece show band, and I, kind of was the director for the band as well, I guess. But it was like we had some horns and we were doing all this, and I hated the music. It was all this started out as a joke in high school when I was in grade 12 and 13 for doing kind of like a Sha Na Na type show band type thing. But we made a lot of money doing that stuff, um, doing those types of things. But the gigs were fun, but that was about it. But I enjoyed playing a lot. I enjoyed playing in bands a lot. I'm doing a couple different bands doing originals, and it was a blast. But the touring thing I think could worry. And I think I got to a point as well where I was kind of looking at things going, I don't know for the lifestyle whether I'm kind of cut out to do that, whether I wanted to do it. Not so much that I didn't want to sacrifice. I just think it was wearing me out, And you're always, you're all on equipment, and the music's great, but so anyways, I ended up going away to school and went to university.
So, university era, around that time, what kind of stuff were you listening to in university? Did you listen to kind of a broad range of things, or were you fairly focused at that time?
I would say that, I mean, I think I ended up, I think, in grade 12, the summer of grade 12. I remember I got a grant to go study French in Quebec City for the summer. And that was a huge, just game changer lifestyle wise. Like, mentally, I think I learned a lot, and not just the language clearly, but great experience and getting exposed to a lot of different things. And that was one thing I found at university as well. I'm sure maybe you found as well, Brian. I think a lot of people do. You get there and you have your own taste, but then you start interacting with a lot of, and you're learning about a lot of things. I remember my first year university, I was in residence, and we had to submit these cards for residence. What are your interests, and what, if you like music, what kind of music? So, I put down, yeah, I like music, I play guitar, whatever. And I sent this card in for the rest. So anyways, I show up in September for first year, and my roommate is this guy, God bless him. I mean, but I get in there and he's like the polar opposite of me. Here's this guy who's like, you know, like a folky type guy, and likes, the nothing against Paul Simon, but Paul Simon and all this kind of. And I come in there and I'm like, Led Zeppelin and whatever, all sorts of weird stuff, and a lot of krautrock, all these different things that I was listening to. So he and I, needless to say, didn't get on that well.
It
you know,
reminds me of the John Belushi character in Animal House when there's a guy on the stairs and he's
yeah.
playing "I Gave My Love a Rose" and he grabs a guitar and
With
he
the
just
guitar,
smashes
boom. Yeah, that thought ran across my mind a few times, but
it.
he was a good guy, actually. It's just unfortunate we probably didn't hit it off. I remember halfway through the year we ended up switching out roommates with another guy because I don't think he could handle it, and I couldn't handle it as well. But it was fun. I mean, I remember getting exposed to some different artists. We were lucky; the guys who lived right next door to us, we were on all guys' floor too, so which was fun at that time. But the guys who lived next door to us were from Cornwall, and two great guys. And the music tastes were different. There were a lot of things that I hadn't been listening to, certainly. So bands like I'm just trying to think of some of this stuff. Oh, things like Babe Ruth, and
I love Babe Ruth.
one guy was really into jazz, and he was really into things like I think some of the CTI stuff at that time was starting to happen, and it was just a very, very interesting, fluid period for music. Like lots of different things that I probably would never have considered. I hooked up with a guy in second year who, great music guy, and he was, it was funny. He was one of those people I learned a lot from as well, right? Just in terms of, and he had a great collection of music, like just right from, Muddy Waters to, he was from Montreal, so Muddy Waters to Leonard Cohen to, he loved Frank Marino and Mahogany Rush, for example. And, I think I was the first time I'd ever heard Otis Rush, which just blew my face off, like just blew my face off, literally. I was just like, holy shit, who is this? So
Yeah.
things like that, right? It was a lot of fun. But I learned a lot from him, and we shared a lot. We both like the Allman Brothers at that time. Interesting period then too, because I think the whole disco thing was starting to happen. So you did have all this kind of R&B ish type stuff really especially I think because I went to school in Ottawa, a lot of influence there from Ottawa, especially Montreal. So you had a lot of this club stuff that was getting played at the university and in the, different venues there. I think I remember my first year, Supertramp played high school, for example. And then, later it was like Barry White had come through town or, it was like just a very, I don't think it was as, rigid maybe in terms of, what people listened to.
Did you
So
listen to
very
Shum
interesting.
FM?
We did, yeah. I think, well, we had show. I remember the first year I was there. I remember we had that was the first year I think the university had its own radio station through closed circuit, if you will. And so we had Shom. I think that was before actually any of the decent FM stations in Ottawa opened. That's how far back this goes.
Because when I
So,
lived in Ottawa, Shum was like the station, Serge
oh,
Présence and stuff, and
Shom was
that's where all
spectacular,
that
right?
progressive,
Yep,
the
spectacular. I mean, I grew up
Genesis and Pink
yeah, I
Floyd.
was literally Toronto area. So for us, Chum FM then were great. I mean, I remember every Sunday at 11 o'clock they were playing, for example, BBC recordings. So, they'd play, one Sunday night at 11 before midnight, they'd play like the whole, Pink Floyd metal tour where they were, you'd hear like the 24-minute long version of Echoes or something, Led Zeppelin live at the BBC and Badfinger and just, great period for music, right? So,
That's great. So after university and you start working, and tell me a little bit maybe about getting into doing some music stuff, because you actually had quite a career in the music industry, especially in the retail side.
yeah. So literally, I was joking about this, but the two best jobs I ever had. First best job I ever had was I worked at a theater for a few years. That was a fantastic job. I just got to see fantastic movies. The whole 70s period, up to the mid 70s, got to see a ton of great movies. And my other favorite job was got a job working in a record store. I worked one year in 75, I think it was. Um, yeah, Christmas 75, for the first time over the Christmas holidays through the working at a local kind of mom and pop record store. They owned three of them. One was in Burlington, Ontario, one was in Hamilton, Ontario, and one was in Sault Ste. Marie. And so I worked at the Hamilton store, and I knew this guy only because he used to come into the theater that I used to work at. So, anyways, I started working at this record store, and this is the time of pre-barcodes, and every record that got sold had an album bag on it, and or I think even then we didn't have album bags. I think then we were actually even recording all the artists, the artist name and the item number, so we would know where to go pick the record. The term picking records. So we would pick the albums. We sell a ton of singles, so that was a lot of fun. I learned a lot. I worked with some jerks as well there, but it was a really fun environment. Great customers. I was working in the store. It was funny because the store was in the east end of Hamilton, which back then was where all the steel plants and stuff. Pretty rough area, like very rough.
Hmm.
And so you would see all sorts of stuff. People with money would come in. You would have people with no money coming in. Some guy would come off his shift working at the coke oven. You could barely see the guy's face, and you could see his eyes. That was pretty much it. Did you guys get the new whatever? This sort of, but a lot of fun and a good experience. It's amazing how tactile all that stuff is. Even today, I go to a record store today. It's fine. You're flipping through the bins. And I remember my first day on the job, and even just it was like Christmas time, and they wouldn't let me sell anything. All they wanted me to do was they called it auditing. I would have to audit all the bins, make sure everything was in order so people could find stuff. So just different time, but a lot of fun. So I did that, and then worked with the government. I went back to school again for another year, and then after that, I worked with the government for a year, government of Ontario, and I hated it. Made good money, but I hated it. And then the same guys that I had worked with offered me a job managing their record store in Sault Ste. Marie. So long story short, did that, and eventually came down Southern Ontario in '81. They filed for receivership because they just got hit The economy at that time was, the interest rates were like 18%. And they just got, there was inflation, the economy was dragging, and the company was bought by another company. I ended up working with them, got hired with them. They bought the assets basically, offered me a job. I went to work with them, and I think that was into the 80s, I guess. And then for the next 3 years, company only had 35 stores. And I think I figured out at one point I worked at 16 of them because basically I was the hammer. I would, any store, I started out, just running a store. And then over time, after about two or three stores, any store that was problematic, I would get thrown into. It's not like, hey, here's a bunch of dough. It was like,
Sounds like a Quentin
no,
Tarantino character.
yeah, kind of. It was kind of, yeah, the licensed troubleshooter guy. So, anyways, basically go in, turn it around, and get stuff working. And I did that, and then eventually got brought inside to help operationalize their point of sales. The company at that point decided they wanted a CFO who was a bright guy, great mentor for me actually, and he had wanted to bring in a POS system. So he brought me in to help operationalize it because I knew the operations. And when we, I remember the first month I was there, I'd taken over for somebody else, and they were kind of ready to roll it out. And it was a real problem for them because I remember I got in there and I go, this thing is just really to this guy Bob, who was the Bob Smith, great guy, who was the CFO there. And I remember saying to him, "This is just, can I just be honest here? We're walking into a disaster. This thing doesn't even work half the time, right? Like they tried, polling it, and I'm dating myself with all this technology, but um, anyways, they decided to scrub it and kill the contract with these guys on my recommendation. I was doing night school at the time, and I had a professor at York who, at the time, had was involved with these guys doing some technology for POS systems. And this stuff they had, was basically a board. They put the board into these NCR registers. But the long story short was our company at the time, based on my recommendation, I connected these guys with the CFO. They all got on. We rolled out to a bunch of the stores. They used them for a long, these POS systems. So I ended up doing that and kind of migrating from that. And the warehouse manager quit. I ended up learning, anyways, long story short, I ended up learning a ton of the business. I just was pretty much fortunate, I guess, to be involved in almost every aspect of the company's business, from the operational side on the retail to, learning the distribution side and the buying component and the marketing component and just everything you could want to learn. I learned and did that for a long time. I got promoted. I actually ended up taking over the retail thing, and I don't want to go through my whole history. It'd take too long, but did that, and I ran the musical stores. And while I was there, in the 5 years that I was there, we doubled the size of the Star Musical World. For anybody not in Canada who doesn't remember them, they were kind of like Musicland in the U.S. So standalone mall retailer, you know, not very few street stores. I think they only had one or two at that point. Um, but we ended up doubling it while I was there for the 5 years. We doubled the volume, doubled the profitability, and just had some good success there. And then I got headhunted. And the reason I ended up leaving them was because the company was owned by an older guy, much older, like almost 80. And he, that was at the time the internet was starting to happen a bit. And he just didn't see it happening. He wanted to only have his money in kind of brick and mortar. And I thought at the time, gee, if this company that hired me was a consumer electronics retailer, and I thought, geez, I could just tell at Best Buy. You and I talked about this in another time, Brian, but I think I could just tell in my mind, anyways, intuitively, that Best Buy, I could see what they were doing in the US. And I just thought, geez, these guys come to Canada, they're just going to decimate everybody. And I thought also, this could be a really good opportunity. And it turned out to be a great opportunity. And I did that till 2007. But when I got there, I did the music thing for about 2 years and had some really good success with that. And then I got asked to kind of run all the other merchandising stuff at a point, and then the company was purchased, strangely enough, by Best Buy. And so I ended up working as a part of Best Buy, helped launch Best Buy and expand Future Shop throughout Canada, and did that and parted ways happily in 2007.
That's where you and I met too. It was
You and I
working
met then,
on,
that's right.
yeah, so it seems so archaic now or hard to believe. But of course, Future Shop and Best Buy wanted to be, first in on things like downloadable music. So well before Apple Music or any of the streaming platforms, things weren't streamed in those days. It was downloading music. So we did a project together, which was dubbed Bonfire, and that was a downloadable music service. And you were the executive sponsor of that project, and I was a project manager on it. And that was
Yeah.
quite a ride.
Well, there was a lot of interest in doing it. I think, I think it kind of, that was a great environment to do things. I mean, the execs there, I was part of that team, but the president and, the people at that time, I think, and even the chairman when it was Future Shop, they were very much into, you know, show us there's a business case here and we'll, let's get after it, and very supportive that way. And so, I think even, for example, with the website, for example, my recollection was you and I had connected early on with the website because we had made a decision wisely to put music and eventually movies and stuff. And I remember specifically you being involved helping us with the database, get
Mhm.
the databases happening with that, using all music and I forget, what else. But, so that was a really, really interesting period. And I think, again, the bonfire thing was really interesting because we were sellers of hardware. And again, I remember at the time I was a bit of a pariah in the music industry somewhat because, well, you're destroying the industry. And I always looked at it, these things are, it's all about distribution largely. The music is the music. That's one thing. And I think the hardware or whatever is somewhat academic to me. It was more just, these things are modes of distribution. You can debate the merits of each one, but at the core of it, if the music's good and the artist, we should be supporting that stuff more than anything else. And which, those companies that I had worked for all did that in various forms with support from the labels and oftentimes without support. We had good relations with all the labels. And I think, even in being involved with, I think it was Pure Tracks to do that downloadable music thing, they were interested. I think they were curious because we were kind of pushing the envelope. Nobody else in Canada was really doing it. And, we did it to, I think it's a cultural change as well, right? And a mindset change for, I think, for merchants, especially, if you will, in the business world to kind of get, we're not just about selling this device. We need to sell this device and we need to have some of this with it, so in some form, right? Which in that case was MP3 and all the rest of it. So very interesting period.
Two little stories that you may or may not remember or have been party to, but that I remember project managing Bonfire and the digital downloadable music. One of them was partnering with Pure Tracks, and I think we had, I don't know who the back end was in terms of providing the bandwidth, and that was the critical part of it, right? To make sure that we had the bandwidth so that if a lot of people came, that the whole system wouldn't crash or things wouldn't have
Right.
issues. So we told them, we are a pretty big retailer here in Canada and we can get a lot of traffic and we're going hard on this. So we need you to make sure that there's a bandwidth. And they were like, no problem, no problem. And of course, when we went live, well, the week beforehand, we were like front of the flyer, which if you were on a Future Shop flyer at the front, the distribution was unbelievable. I mean,
Yep.
as you
Massive.
know better than I, the brand awareness for Future Shop was like 95%. I mean, it was unbelievable and everybody
Right.
knew it. So we got the promotion and we got the push. Everything was great. And we were on the phone with that bandwidth company. And anyways, the whole thing just crashed. Like it just throttled. We got so much traffic on day one and they didn't have enough bandwidth. And of course, that happened a lot in that space, right? Because anytime things were being streamed, you just never had the bandwidth. This is sort of before the AWS model that
Right.
Amazon's running and stuff
Yeah,
like
the
that.
issue with the at that time was again, I think server bandwidth, and we again, like you mentioned with the Pure Tracks thing, people underestimated the firm we had used. had underestimated our own capabilities and kind of volume we were doing. And I know we gave them all projections that were we thought conservative, and sure as hell, same thing. I mean, so we ended up, fortunately, it was a pretty quick fix. I remember it being specifically around Boxing Day, which was a much bigger sales day than it is today, but just huge numbers. And but anyways, thank God they were able to do it.